Welcome to the podcast series on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings. I am your host, Liloba Paul, UNHCR Learning Development Officer on topics related to gender-based violence. This work is brought to you by the Safe from the Start Project, a collaboration between UNHCR's Division of International Protection and the Global Learning and Development Center in Budapest. Our topic today is water, sanitation, and hygiene, WASH, and mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation. It is my pleasure to have with me Nosa Boadi, WASH officer in UNHCR's Zimbabwe operation. Welcome, Nosa.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to
Liloba.
jump into the questions. Could you share with us a bit about your experience with mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in your activities as a WASH officer?
Great. Yes. So when in my last operation in Tanzania, we mainstream GBV risk mitigation in WASH using a few indicators, two indicators. That was tracking the percent of latrines that were lockable as a primary indicator. And the secondary indicator was the percent of latrines with lighting in the vicinity. Since we already had a joint mainstreaming project that was already ongoing, where we had installed streetlights at clusters of shared latrines in certain zones at the Induta camp. And we chose these zones based upon the perception of risk as related by the POCs. So there were two main indicators, percent of latrines that were lockable and the percent of latrines with lighting in the vicinity. And these we had put into an action plan that was jointly developed by the MFT.
Thank you. It sounds like you've already talked about several things here related to indicators, tracking perceptions of persons of concern on GBV risks, and an action plan. Thank you. What were some of the challenges you faced?
The challenges we faced were more technical and programmatic, not so much the selection of the indicators or recognition of the problem. So what we needed to do was to then develop an accurate and reliable method to actually track these indicators that we selected to track them on a regular basis. So we developed a system of mobile data collection involving the POCs themselves as data collectors. So we had already developed a mobile data collection system at another camp at Delhi, where POCs were tracking the flow rates at tap stands across the camp on a daily basis, so as to give us information on different levels of service across the water supply network. So we then just expanded the system and turned it towards sanitation. So then we developed the COBO form that the POCs could use to upload information on these two key indicators, the percent of latrines that are lockable and the percent of latrines with lighting in their vicinity. However, we use this as an opportunity to even gather more information, more technical information, really, about the latrines, such as whether they were full, whether they were clean, and the number of families that were sharing each latrine. So, in that sense, we were fully integrated between tracking GBV indicators and WASH technical indicators. Initially, I would say the main challenge, though, was on a programmatic level, was actually getting the partner to facilitate the POCs regularly collecting this data and being able to upload it to Wi-Fi at their offices. So there was a bit of a lack of interest initially by the implementing partner, but eventually we were able to gather some useful data some months. And that started to give us a pretty good picture of the state of affairs with the latrines. What we found overall was that most latrines were not lockable from the inside. In fact, less than 20% were lockable from the inside, if I recall correctly, whereas most of them were lockable from the outside. So that was an interesting finding.
Yes, and it is interesting also to hear about these efforts to engage persons of concern regularly in that data collection. Thank you for sharing that. Do you have an example of a promising practice you carried out?
Well, I would say the promising practice was actually the development of the mobile data collection system that was specific to this problem, where we then empower the POCs to provide essentially direct feedback about the level of service that they experience directly to UNHCR. So in that sense, it became a conversation between the POCs and the UNHCR themselves without having to involve the implementing partner as an intermediary. So I would say that that was really a good, promising practice that could be expanded.
Yes. What are some suggestions or advice that you would want to share with other members of the WASH workforce?
I would say to develop indicators that are measurable and doable and affordable to address. In our case, we had to develop a monitoring system as a consequence of choosing the indicators that we selected, as no existing system was yet in place to monitor those indicators that we thought were important. So choose something measurable and doable.
And are there some resources that you would recommend to other WASH personnel that you find useful yourself for mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation into the WASH sector?
Yes, well, there was a reference tool called the Guidelines for Integrating Gender-Based Violence Interventions in Humanitarian Action, and it featured a set of essential actions and minimum commitments for each sector. And so it was like a cookbook, and it was pretty straightforward. And that is the reference tool that we use to develop our joint plan of action.
Yes, thank you. I think some other ones too that we might want to add would be the UNHCR WASH protection and accountability. And I would also want to add the Global Protection Cluster, protection mainstreaming and training package. So I think that would round it out too.
Absolutely, yes. The UNHCR publication on protection and accountability actually was quite useful in a broad sense. And yeah, it also formed a basis for the development of the plan of action.
Thank you, Nosa, for your time with us and for sharing your experiences with mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation, also for the recommendations on resources in the area of WASH.
Well, it's been great to share the WASH perspective, actually.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And also to all of our listeners, do tune in to the next podcast in our series from the GLDC on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings.